There is a bottle of bourbon sitting in a warehouse in Ontario. It is unopened, unlabeled for sale, unavailable for purchase. It cost approximately $40 to produce. It was shipped across the border with proper documentation. It was purchased by a licensed importer destined for restaurant wine lists and retail shelves across Canada's most populous province. And it will never be sold. Not because it is spoiled, not because it failed quality control, not because Canadian consumers don't want it, because it became a political hostage. $1.5 million worth of prestige California wine seized by the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. Elite Napa Valley brands, already sold, already shipped, already meant for dinner tables and celebrations, locked away in government warehouses. An 85% collapse in American spirits exports to Canada in a single quarter, the lowest level ever recorded. 35% of all U.S. wine exports gone. Kentucky bourbon distilleries that had built 20% of their projected sales around the Canadian market. Expansion plans canceled overnight. And a phrase that should terrify every American exporter in every industry. Buy Canadian instead. Today, we're not talking about fighter jets or aluminum smelters or potash mines. We're talking about something that touches every household, every restaurant, every celebration. We're talking about what happens when the world's most famous consumer brand becomes a symbol of political resentment. This is the story of the Bourbon War. The story of how Canada, instead of retaliating tariff for tariff on steel and aluminum, looked at the United States and asked a devastatingly simple question. What do you care about more than factories? What do your voters feel in their wallets and their identities? What can we take away that will make this hurt? Not in boardrooms, but in bars. The answer was bourbon and wine and spirits. And the result was an 85% collapse, $100 million in seized inventory, and a permanent restructuring of the North American alcohol market. This is not a trade dispute. This is a case study in asymmetric warfare. And America lost. Let's start with the structural reality that most Americans do not understand about their northern neighbor. Canada does not have a private alcohol retail market. In most of the United States, liquor stores are private businesses. They respond to consumer demand, not government policy. A tariff might raise prices, but it does not remove products from shelves entirely. Canada is different. Provincial liquor monopolies, the LCBO in Ontario, the SAQ in Quebec, BC liquor stores in British Columbia, the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation, control every aspect of alcohol distribution and retail. They decide what is listed. They decide what is promoted. They decide what is removed. And when a provincial government decides that American alcohol is no longer welcome on its shelves, there is no appeal, no First Amendment challenge, no antitrust lawsuit, no consumer revolt, just empty shelf space. This is the asymmetry that Washington never accounted for. You can tariff Canadian steel. Canadian steel producers can absorb some cost, pass some along, and continue selling to American manufacturers who have no alternative supply. But you cannot tariff Canadian shelf space because the shelf space is not a market. It is a government-controlled distribution channel. And when that channel closes, the product does not become more expensive. It becomes unavailable. This is not a price shock. This is a market deletion, and it happened in a matter of days. The case of Rogers and Company is the perfect illustration of how this weapon actually functions. Rogers is a major Canadian importer of premium wines. They specialize in high-end California vintages, the kind of bottles that sommeliers recommend and collectors seek out. They had over 1.5 million worth of prestige Napa Valley wine in transit when the LCBO announced its American alcohol pull. Already sold, already shipped, already allocated to restaurants and retailers across Ontario. Seized. Not recalled, not returned. Seized. The wine was physically taken into government custody, locked in warehouses, rendered unsellable. Rogers' managing director described the aftermath: staff layoffs, office closures, delivery workers put on reduced schedules. A private company caught in the crossfire of a trade war it did not start, with inventory it could not access and customers it could not serve. And they were not alone. Across Canada, more than 100 million worth of American alcohol remains in government possession today. California Cabernets, Oregon Pinot Noirs, New York Rieslings, Kentucky Bourbons, Tennessee whiskeys. All of it trapped. Now imagine you are a small wine producer in New York's Hudson Valley. You are not Constellation Brands. You are not Gallo. You are Todd Cavallo, a winemaker whose annual Canadian orders totaled approximately 10,000. $10,000 is not a rounding error for a multinational conglomerate. It is survival margin for a small family operation. Cavallo lost those orders overnight. He described taking on outside work just to keep his business alive. This is the granular reality of trade war. Not macroeconomic aggregates, not diplomatic communiques. A winemaker in New York picking up extra shifts because his Canadian customers stopped buying. Then came the move that transformed this from economic retaliation into political warfare. British Columbia Premier David Abey announced it openly. The province would target American liquor products from Republican-leaning states. The logic was brutally simple. Bourbon, by law, can only be produced in the United States. And most bourbon comes from Kentucky, a state Trump won by 26 points in 2024. If Kentucky bourbon producers started feeling economic pain, their congressional delegation would hear about it. If their congressional delegation heard about it, pressure would flow back to the White House. This is not retaliation. This is leverage. And it worked. The Barrel Distillery, a small Kentucky bourbon producer, had built strong momentum in Western Canada. They projected the Canadian market would account for up to 20% of their total sales. Expansion plans were drafted. Distribution agreements were signed. Marketing campaigns were developed. Then the boycott hit. The co-founder explained it simply. Every case matters for a small distillery. Suddenly, entire shipments had nowhere to go. Inventory piled up. Growth projections collapsed. This was not abstract policy. This was existential threat. And it was targeted precisely, deliberately, effectively at the political base of the president who started the trade war. Now let's look at the numbers. Second quarter, 2025. The Distilled Spirits Council of the United States releases its quarterly export report. American spirits exports to Canada, down 85%. Not 20%, not 50%, 85%. Below 10 million total for the first time in recorded history. American wine exports to Canada, down 94%, not 90%, 94%. Canada, which purchased 35% of all U.S. wine exports in 2024, had almost entirely vanished as a market. Chris Swanger, president of the U.S. Spirits Trade Group, used careful diplomatic language. Very troubling. American producers are being hurt significantly. Translation: this is a catastrophe. Brown-Forman, the parent company of Jack Daniel's, reported sales to Canada dropped more than 60% in a single quarter. Executives warned investors that trade tensions were creating significant headwinds across their global business. Not headwinds. Hurricane force winds. And here is the detail that should have kept every American trade official awake at night. Canada was not alone. U.S. spirits exports to the United Kingdom fell nearly 30%. Exports to Japan dropped more than 20%. Together, Canada, the UK, Japan, and the European Union account for 70% of America's international spirits market. 70%. And every single one of these markets was watching what happened in Canada. Every single one was learning the same lesson. American products are politically vulnerable. American suppliers can be disrupted. American trade policy is unpredictable. This is not a temporary setback. This is a permanent erosion of brand equity. Industry leaders began using a word that should terrify every American exporter in every sector: stigmatized. Not boycotted, not tariffed, not sanctioned, stigmatized. The distinction is critical. A boycott is temporary, it ends when the grievance is resolved. A tariff is negotiable. It can be reduced, eliminated, or replaced with quota arrangements. Stigma is permanent. Once a product becomes associated with political resentment, once consumers internalize the idea that purchasing it is an endorsement of policies they oppose, once retailers and restaurateurs begin treating it as a liability rather than an asset, you cannot tariff your way back to acceptance. You cannot negotiate away a cultural shift. One California wine importer put it directly. The boycott is stigmatizing the entire category. It's telling consumers where to focus their resentment. Even Canadian retailers admitted the situation had become emotional. Some customers were excited when American bottles briefly returned to shelves in late 2025. Others refused to touch them at all. For millions of Canadians, buying American alcohol had become a political choice. Not about taste, not about price, not about quality, about loyalty. And loyalty, once redirected, does not automatically flow back. December 2025. Several Canadian provinces quietly allowed American alcohol back into stores. But this was not normalization. This was liquidation. Nova Scotia sold more than 2.2 million worth of American spirits in a single week. But the province's premier made the terms unmistakably clear. Once that inventory is gone, no new U.S. orders will be placed. Not, we'll review the situation. Not, we look forward to resuming normal trade relations. No new orders. This was not a reopening, this was a farewell sale. The bottles were sold, the revenue was donated to charity, and the shelf space was permanently reassigned to Canadian and international alternatives. This is the difference between a tariff war and a structural shift. Tariffs can be removed overnight. Shelf space cannot be reacquired on demand. Retailers who spent 18 months rebuilding their wine lists around Canadian, European, and South American products are not going to cancel those orders because Kentucky bourbon is suddenly tariff-free again. Distributors who develop new relationships with Nova Scotia wineries and Quebec cider houses are not going to abandon those supply chains because the political temperature has cooled. Consumers who discovered that Canadian whiskey is actually quite good and discovered it because American whiskey was unavailable are not going to forget that discovery. The market has restructured, and restructuring, once accomplished, is extremely difficult to reverse. This brings us to the most significant long-term consequence of the Bourbon War. Canadian producers discovered they could compete. Provincial sales data tells the story. Canadian whiskey and wine sales up 24%, Ontario wine sales up 56%, Nova Scotia spirits up 24%. Record-breaking sales at holiday tastings in Toronto and Ottawa. Bars and restaurants across the country rebuilding their drink menus around domestic products. One Nova Scotia distiller described the shift in consumer behavior with genuine amazement. Customers walk into the store and ask a simple question: what is local? Not what's on sale, not what's highly rated. What is local? 18 months ago, that question was asked by a niche segment of environmentally conscious consumers. Today, it is mainstream because politics made it mainstream. Every Canadian who walked into a liquor store and saw empty shelves where American whiskey used to be was forced to make a choice. They could buy nothing. They could buy imported alternatives from Europe or South America. Or they could try Canadian. Millions chose Canadian. And they discovered that Canadian whiskey, long dismissed as a poor imitation of the real thing, has improved dramatically over the past 2 decades. Crown Royal, Canadian Club, 40 Creek, Alberta Premium, Lot 40, J.P. Wiser's, these are not commodity products anymore. They are award-winning spirits competing successfully in international competitions against the best American and European producers. The trade war accelerated a quality story that was already underway. It gave Canadian consumers permission and incentive to explore their own domestic category. And once that exploration happened, once those taste preferences were formed, once those brand loyalties were established, they are not reverting. So here is the question that no trade negotiator wants to answer publicly. Even if every tariff is eliminated, every retaliatory measure withdrawn, every diplomatic relationship restored, will the Canadian alcohol market ever look the same? The evidence suggests no. Not because Canadian consumers are permanently angry at the United States. Not because provincial liquor monopolies are ideologically committed to excluding American products. Because the market has already adapted. Restaurants have rebuilt their wine lists. Retailers have reassigned their shelf space. Distributors have established new supply relationships. Consumers have formed new preferences and habits. Reversing these adaptations is not impossible. It is merely very, very difficult. And the incentives to attempt it are weak. Why would a Nova Scotia liquor store manager cancel an order for locally produced gin that is selling well, supported by the provincial government and popular with customers, just to make room for a California craft distiller who might be tariffed out of existence again in 18 months? Why would they accept the risk? The international trade professor quoted in the document put it in deceptively simple terms. The relationship has changed. That is the understatement of the decade. The relationship has not changed. It has been restructured, not through legislation, not through formal policy, through millions of individual decisions by consumers, retailers, distributors, and producers, each rational in isolation, each cumulative in effect. This is not a boycott. It is a market reset. And resets do not reverse. There is a photograph that every Kentucky bourbon distiller knows. It shows rows of white oak barrels, charred on the inside, aging in multi-story rick houses. The angel's share evaporating into the warm Kentucky air. For generations, those barrels represented something more than whiskey. They represented American cultural dominance, the idea that the world wanted what America produced. Not just our technology, our entertainment, our weapons, our taste. Bourbon was the liquid embodiment of this assumption. A product that could only be made in the United States, that had no equivalent elsewhere, that commanded premium prices in every global market. That assumption is now contested. Not because bourbon is suddenly worse, not because Canadian whiskey is suddenly better, because the political conditions that sustained open markets and consumer trust have eroded. And when trust erodes, everything becomes more difficult. Tariffs can be calculated, supply chains can be rerouted, contracts can be renegotiated. But trust, once lost, cannot be restored by executive order. The Bourbon War is not the largest front in this continental realignment. It is not the most strategically significant. It is not the most economically consequential. But it is the most personal. It is the front that entered millions of households, thousands of restaurants, countless celebrations. It is the front that turned a bottle of whiskey into a symbol of political resentment. It is the front that taught Canadian consumers, pragmatic, moderate, traditionally pro-American Canadian consumers, that buying American is a choice, not a default, and choices, once exercised, are not easily abandoned. The tariffs may fall, the boycotts may end, the seized wine may eventually be released. But the shelf space has been reassigned. The taste preferences have been formed. The supply chains have been restructured. And a generation of Canadian consumers has learned to ask a question that their parents never considered. What is local? That question will not be unasked. And that, more than any tariff or trade agreement, is the lasting legacy of the Bourbon War. What do you think? Will Canadian consumers ever return to American spirits at pre-2025 levels? Or has the market permanently restructured? Was the red state targeting strategy a legitimate use of economic leverage or an unacceptable escalation? And what other consumer goods categories might be vulnerable to similar dynamics in future trade disputes? Let me know in the comments. If you want to track these trade and consumer behavior shifts before they become headlines, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We're watching the signals the rest of the world misses.